Well, as I mentioned, this morning is Advent, the first Sunday of Advent. And what's funny for me is that I didn't even know what Advent was when I grew up. I grew up in a tradition that didn't do that. They weren't heathens, they weren't pagan, I promise. It was a Christian religion. But yeah, it's just I grew up in a tradition that just didn't celebrate Advent, not as a distinct thing, but they did kind of what Advent's about. So I guess that's my question. What is Advent? What is Advent about? Why does it exist? What is it? Well, in simplest terms, Advent is the 4 Sundays before Christmas. Right? That's fundamentally what it breaks down to, but that's not really what it's about. Right? What it's about is getting ready for the Christmas season, right? Being able to embrace the spirit of Christmas, right? The meaning of Christmas. Because I would say that all of us have had a time in our lives where we were just in a really busy season. It could have been busy with family stuff. It could have been busy with work stuff. It could have been just kind of being emotionally overwhelmed. And if you ever had a year where Christmas is coming, and you're always like, I'll deal with it later. I'll get to it later. I'll settle myself down later. And then before you know it, Christmas is just kind of here, and you weren't really ready for it. I mean, you may have had your presents or whatever, but you weren't really ready for it. And then the day's over and it's gone. And you're like, geez, I didn't even really experience Christmas this year. I mean, I was there for the day, but I didn't really experience it. And so the purpose of Advent is to help us to more fully experience it. To not wait until, December 24th, at 6 o'clock at night when the service starts, to go, okay, it's Christmas now. But to actually begin kind of preparing ourselves in advance. And when I say prepare ourselves, I mean it's really to do our best to be present in what it means. Because Christmas is a gift. Right? That God sent Jesus for a purpose, right? Born as a man to actually shed his power in heaven, to be born as one of us, to then know what it's like to walk through life as one of us, and to give us a path to reconcile us to God. That's the gift of Christmas. And so what we do during the Advent season is to really kind of try to experience those things. And traditionally, the way we go about doing that is that each week we focus on one particular theme of Christmas. Right? So as we think about, Advent, we see a picture like this, and that's the very, very Christmassy kind of, celebrating Christmas Day. But we want to really think about what are the themes of Christmas. So each week over the next 4 weeks, we'll talk about one simple idea. And each week we'll kind of see what that means in terms of Christmas. Now, one of the things that I like to do during the Advent season is focus on the basics, those fundamental things that really anchor us in the Christmas celebration. Because there is something a challenge that we have. And I talk about this often, that we live in a time where we are just loaded with distractions. Right? Whether it's political stuff, whether it's the news stuff, whether it's social media stuff, whether, you're on, whether it's X or Facebook, whether you're on Discord or Reddit, right? There's just all these things kind of overwhelming us. And there's all these things that are trying to take us out of just being present in where we are and what we're doing. So for me, the goal of Advent is to really just be present. Because, so many of us are searching. Now, you may already be a believer in Jesus Christ, that you believe he's who he says he is, but you might be searching for a deeper sense of peace, a deeper sense of awareness. Or maybe you're on a spiritual journey, that you're convinced there's something bigger than just this life, and you're just not quite sure what it is or what it might be. Or maybe you're thinking Jesus might be it, but you don't really know whether that's the case. Right? That's a journey that we're all on. So the question I would have for those of you who have put your faith in Jesus Christ, if someone walks up to you and says, I think I'm kind of interested in this Jesus stuff or this Christianity stuff or whatever language they might use, why do you believe what you believe? What would you say to them if they asked you that question? If someone says, what is the reason you have hope in all of this? I mean, Are you prepared with an answer? Because the Apostle Peter actually tells us that we should be prepared with an answer. Peter literally encourages us with this. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. Do this with gentleness and respect. And that's a key thing, right? Because there's a lot of folks running around today who want to tell you about why they believe in Jesus, and they want to convince you with a hammer. Right? And Peter says that's not the way we do it. We do it with gentleness and respect. We respect people where they are in their journey, and we interact with them gently. So what would you say? Just think to yourself, what would you say if someone asked you why you have hope in Jesus? Now, as you think about that, I wanted to kind of create a somewhat parallel scenario that I think kind of models the way this goes sometimes. Imagine for a second that someone walks up to you that you kind of know, and they tell you that they're kind of interested in learning to drive a car. Now, they tell you that they're very tentative about it. They think they might be interested in driving a car. They're not really sure they need to know how to drive a car. That, they became old enough to drive years ago. And they think maybe they're ready now to drive a car. And they'd ask you, can you help me? Can you help me do that? And what are the things I need to know in order to drive a car? And one approach would be is that you start with some high-level details. Just kind of, the basics. This is the steering wheel. These are the pedals, that sort of thing. But, so often when someone asks us about something, if we're not really prepared with what we want to say, what do? We'll commonly just start talking about things we're interested in. So somebody asks you how to drive a car, and you're a motorhead, right? You love the way cars work. And so you start with the steering wheel and the pedals. Next thing you know, you're in the pistons and valves, and you go, oh, geez, and the valves. Well, most cars have fuel injectors now. Fuel injectors. Do you know that both diesel engines and gas engines have fuel injectors, but they work differently? And you go on that rant for a while. Or if you're like me, someone who likes data and digging into statistics, someone were to ask me, if I'm not prepared with an answer, I might start at some reasonable things, but before long, I start quoting highway safety statistics to you. And did you know that tens of thousands of people die every year in the United States alone from driving cars? In fact, it's so bad, over 100 people a day on average die in the United States from driving in cars. And it's been getting worse over the past 10 years. Are you ready for a drive? They're going to say some version of, no thanks, I'll stick with Uber, right? And, and I say that, and it sounds kind of ridiculous, but how often when we have a conversation about our faith, and someone asks us about it, we just start talking about things that we find interesting. Not the things that they need to know to understand their journey to faith, but things that, really esoteric details, eschatology stuff starts coming up. The end time stuff starts coming up because I find that interesting. We're kind of digging into huge details of the Old Testament that we don't really need to know to start to follow Jesus. And so often we start talking about death and what do you want to have happen when you die? And you're talking to someone who's 25 years old who's not thinking about death at all. And we do this, and where we had an opportunity to share with someone what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ, what it means to put our faith in Jesus, we talk about all these things that are not core to understanding our walk with Jesus. We talk about things that we find interesting. Or the other thing that I think happens commonly, someone says, hey, why do you find hope in Jesus? And since we haven't really thought about the answer, we go like, well, I don't know. I've just always had it since I was a kid. I've just always believed, or I don't know. I went with my parents. I kept going. Probably totally truthful. Right? In fact, everything that I've gone through, whether it's about the way a motor works, to the statistics I referenced, to eschatology stuff, to I've just been doing it since I was a kid, every one of those things is truthful, accurate, and completely not helpful. And that's the thing we have to remember, that if you're someone who's put your hope in Jesus, it's about embracing a relationship, about walking that path with Jesus and the hope that it brings. So today, our topic is, our Christmas theme is hope. The hope that came with Christmas. Because the reality is that the birth of Jesus and his life were all about hope. That Jesus literally changed the narrative, the entire narrative. Jesus changed the narrative so substantially when he arrived in the first century that there are things that we take for granted now that would have seemed completely unimaginable to the people in the first century prior to Jesus. I mean, we fundamentally believe that all people have value, right? That every human being is valuable. Prior to Jesus, that is not what people believed. The primary thought is that most people are disposable. That there was this very narrow group of people at the top, generally people who were royals and people very close to them. They were valuable, and everyone else was just fodder for whatever they needed. And Jesus came along and said, no, everyone is valuable. In fact, everyone has intrinsic value. That as a human being, you are valuable. That in the first century, the only people who were considered valuable were those people at the top. Jesus said, no, everybody's valuable. Jesus elevated the status of women, right? Jesus elevated the status of children, both of which were largely considered completely disposable. He says that's not how it is, because you know why? Because your Father in heaven loves them. Your Father in heaven cares about them. That they are important to him. And you're important to him. So they should all be important to you. And this idea that you were important to God, that was a foreign idea to most people in the first century. That the religious leaders of that time taught things that made people think that God was fickle and uninterested and impersonal. And there was no pleasing him. That he was kind of having you hopping from one foot to another with all these rules. But it turns out that most of those rules were man-made rules to help those that were in religious leadership gain and maintain power. And Jesus comes along and says, that's not what God's like. God's not distant. God's not fickle. God's personal. God wants to be in a relationship with you. That God seeks a connection to you. That's what it means. That's what you mean to God. That was the hope that Jesus brought. That every single person is valuable. God seeks a deeper relationship with every one of you. And he wants to walk through life with you because he loves you. A completely foreign concept to most people at that time. And just to kind of look at this idea of the reason for our hope, we actually can find it in probably what is the most famous Bible verse there is. If back in the 80s and 90s you watched football, you'd always see a picture of it in the end zone. You know what it was? John 3:16. Right? John 3:16, the most famous, so famous it made it to the NFL sort of thing, right? Right? But what does John 3:16 say? Right? For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. What is it? That verse is an invitation, right? That God wanted a relationship with you so much, wanted to connect with you so much, that he took something that was of extraordinary value to him, his Son, Jesus, and sent him to us to help us have a new path of connection with God. And one of the things that John wanted to make really clear is that this idea of sending Jesus, this is meant to be a message of hope. Because we all kind of have heard John 3:16, but how many of us have heard John 3:17? They tie together really importantly. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. My friends, that's the gift of Christmas. With the birth of Jesus, God had sent the one who could actually restore our relationship. That's the gift of Christmas. That Jesus came to earth to bring hope. Right? A hope that would help us to better understand God. A hope that would give us a deeper relationship with God. Right? And all this is actually written by the Apostle John. The Apostle John, who was someone who had actually walked personally with Jesus when John was a very young man. We don't know exactly how old John was. We figure he was probably 13 or 14, maybe 15 on the high end. And so John had walked with Jesus, had seen these things that Jesus did, had these experiences with Jesus, and he would eventually write what we call the Gospel of John. Right? Now, all a gospel is, all that word means, is that it's something written about the life of Jesus. So the Gospel of John is John's account of what he learned and experienced from Jesus. But now, one of the things that we often don't recognize is that when John wrote the Gospel of John, he didn't do that immediately after the resurrection of Jesus. John wouldn't actually write what we call the Gospel of John for decades. We think he was probably an old man by the time he wrote it down. So what's kind of interesting about that is that John, who had these very personal experiences with Jesus, then spent his life talking to people about those experiences. He spent time thinking about those experiences, processing what it all meant. What was it all about? And then finally, as he's an old man, he's probably approaching the end of his life, to preserve what he had put together, he wrote it down, or at least had probably dictated it, but had it written down. And that's what we call the Gospel of John. And the thing that I love about what John tells us about Jesus is what we read with the candle lighting today. Because in what we read with the candle lighting, this is John saying that, okay, I walked with Jesus for probably about 3 years. I've spent decades of my life processing this information, telling other people about it, kind of figuring out, hey, when I tell people this way, they understand. When I tell them another way, they seem to understand less well. So John would have had a well-honed message about Jesus by the time he wrote this down. And so the verses that Joanne and David read this morning are basically John saying that, okay, if you start to read this, and you only read the very beginning of what I've written, here's what I want you to understand. Here's what I want you to take away from it. Because looking at the very, very beginning of that, what Joanne started is actually John chapter 1, verse 1. So the very first things he wrote down. And what John wanted his readers to know is who Jesus was and what he had come here to do. That was the goal of writing this down. So in terms of who Jesus is, what John wanted his readers to know, what he wants you to know, what he wants me to know, is that Jesus is God. And John could have gone through a whole bunch of complex explanations about this, right? He could have talked about sightings of Jesus in the Old Testament. He could have gotten into all that stuff. He could have talked about second coming stuff. John could have talked about all these details about the Trinity and the way it all ties together. He could have done all those things. But he didn't do that. He said it simply, and he said it plainly. Now, looking at what Joanne read this morning, right? It says, in the beginning, the Word already existed. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. So when John says the Word, what's he talking about? He's talking about Jesus. So he's calling Jesus the Word. Now, why does he do that? Why does he call Jesus the Word? Like, the Word sort of thing. Why does he call Jesus the Word? Because Jesus is an exact representation of God. That if you want a description of what God is like, look at Jesus. You want to know what God thinks is important? Look at what Jesus thinks is important. You want to know how God feels people should be treated? Look at how Jesus treated people. Who were the only people we ever record Jesus getting angry at? Religious leaders who weighed people down with heavy burdens. They're the only people we ever have recorded of Jesus losing his temper. Oh, and also people who were using religion to rip people off, right, steal from them. They were the only times we see Jesus get angry. In every other situation, what you see from Jesus is patience and space. I mean, he spoke the truth, right? He didn't withhold the truth, but always with compassion and love. So John is saying that, so that's what God is like. That's what we see when we look at Jesus. He shows us what God is really like. And so one of the things that I actually like to do whenever I read this opening to the Gospel of John, I like to take everywhere it says the word and explicitly say, Jesus. Because it brings this kind of deeper clarity, at least for me, as I read it, brings a deeper clarity. Because reading that same verse now, but with Jesus instead of the Word, it says, in the beginning, Jesus already existed. Jesus was with God, and Jesus was God. So what's he saying? He says in the beginning, Jesus already existed. What he's saying is that although Jesus' earthly ministry was finite, in other words, it had a distinct starting point and a distinct end, Jesus is infinite. That Jesus has always existed. He's always existed with God because Jesus is God. And he wanted us to know that Jesus was God coming to earth to rescue humanity. Now, as John continues, Jesus existed in the beginning with God. God created everything through Jesus, and nothing was created except through Jesus. Jesus gave life to everything that was created, and his life brought light to everyone. And that light shines in the darkness, and the darkness can never extinguish it. And what John is saying there is so important. John is saying that the reason that any of us have life at all is because of Jesus. That Jesus is the original giver of life. And so the one who gave you your mortal life, one who gave me my mortal life, that life that kind of ends when we die, well, he's the giver of life. So if he's the one who gave you life, he's the one who has the power to change that life, to renew that life, to make that life eternal. John's saying that that's who Jesus is, that he was the one who created everything, and because he's the one who gave you life in the first place, he's the one who has the power to transform that life, to renew it, to find something that's richer than what we find in this life alone. Right? Not that we're waiting to die to find renewed life, because we can find it in Jesus right away. That when we put our faith in Jesus and we allow his power to move on us, that our life begins to become transformed, that we become renewed. And as he talks about Jesus brought light, John's acknowledging that the world can be a dark place with so much pain and so much suffering and so much evil at times. John's saying that, but Jesus brought the light, and it's in that light that we overcome the darkness. And that when we accept Jesus, that light moves inside of us, and we get to be a piece of that light, that we can start to move into the darkness and bring a light with it. That's this renewal that we have in this life, that when we accept that, we get that power from God to be part of bringing that light. And the thing that I find kind of so interesting in all this is that John starts out with this incredibly poetic description of what Jesus is like, and he's talking about the Word and how all these pieces tie together. But something that was so important to John was that we understand. So after he goes to this kind of poetic description of who Jesus is and what Jesus is doing and what it means when we accept Jesus, he makes a really simple statement that summarizes the entire gospel. John says, to all who believed him and accepted him, in other words, to all who believed Jesus and accepted Jesus, Jesus gave the right to become children of God. That if we will have faith that Jesus is who he said he is, that Jesus did what he said he will do, we become children of God. We become part of the family of God. That we become more deeply connected to God. We become more led by God. And then through that, this renewed life we find in this life, we ultimately spend eternity in the presence of God. John wanted us to know that that's the hope that came with Christmas Day. And so as we kind of prepare to wrap up, the thing that I want us to think about is that if you are someone who's put your faith in Jesus, and you think about these gifts that you've found, you've given, you may not even thought much about them. But if you think about the gifts that you've received, when someone says to you, why do you believe, or at least why do you find hope in this? What can you say? What do you tell someone? Because the most powerful way to connect with someone is to be honest and personal. right? To open your heart. You know, when I grew up in a very evangelical environment, it was like you had to give your testimony, right? Call it what you want. It's telling your story. It's sharing what God has done in your life and what that connection with Jesus, how it's transformed you and what it's led you to do that you may not have done otherwise. How have you been part of making a difference in other people's lives? How have you found renewal in your own life? What are the things that you were struggling with that you started to gain traction against and to move beyond those? Because there's your personal story is yours personally, right? No one can argue with it. If you simply speak about the truth about what God has done in your life, no one can argue with that. And it's yours, so you share it. You'd be willing to tell people about what you've experienced and what you've seen. And the beauty of the gift of salvation through Jesus is it has nothing to do with being good enough. That, you know, there's kind of this concept that good people go to heaven. Maybe. What's good enough? What's the line? What's good enough? I mean, have you ever hated anyone? Have you ever taken advantage of anyone, ever? Have you ever done anything harmful to anyone? Have you ever wished harm on anyone? Well, we've talked about that. As the New Testament describes sin, sin is anything we do that harms someone else or harms ourselves. And Jesus makes it clear that even wishing harm on someone has that same effect, because if you think that way about someone, it affects the way you treat them. So the idea is that, you know, what is the bar for good enough? New Testament tells us we can't reach it. And the good news is that we don't have to. That's the whole point of salvation by grace, is that it's through faith that we are transformed. There's this idea that we must first transform ourselves, and then we'll be good enough for the faith. But that's just not how it works. But now, once we put our faith in Jesus and we embrace that gift, there should be a transformation as we receive that gift. And we do start to change, and we do start to break free from things, and we do start to be more impactful in the world around us. But it's a process. It takes time, right? It's something that we all have to work through. And the thing that we find is that even the Apostle John, in fact, all of the apostles, if you read through the 4 gospel narratives, you realize that even as they walked with Jesus, even as they knew him personally, they were confused all the time. That Jesus would tell them things, they never quite got it, they never quite understood. But over the years, they began to understand, right? That's the walk of faith, right? The walk of faith is that you put your faith in Jesus, and you understand a bit, but as you spend time following Jesus, because that's what Jesus called us to do, was to follow him, right? That Jesus shows us what's important to God and how we should treat people. So Jesus says, follow me, saying that, do those same sort of things. That's what leads to that deeper transformation. That our faith is important, but the response to faith is action. My friends, that is the Christmas gift. That through Jesus, we have that path to be transformed. But also, we have that path to be transformers. When we're willing to share our faith, when we're willing to speak into the lives of others, when we're willing to be present with people when they're struggling, that's our opportunity to do something. So the question, of course, is that if you are a Jesus follower and you embrace the hope in Jesus that you have, what's the easiest way to open the conversation about Jesus with someone? Come to church on Christmas Eve. I mean, I do that kind of as a laugh, but the reality is that there's something about Christmas, this Christmas season, that our hearts seem to change somehow, that we become more interested in caring for other people in a way we don't necessarily the rest of the year. We become more open to spiritual concepts, to the thought of God being reality, right? These are all things that seem to just kind of happen with the Christmas season. And so a great way to get the conversation started, or maybe you're already in a conversation with someone and you just kind of don't know what the next step should be, invite them to Christmas Eve service. I'll pick up the ball for 20 minutes for you, and we'll talk about things, right? And we'll talk about this story of Christmas and what it means in our lives. The thing that we want to understand is that so often when someone asks us about the reason for our faith, We can either kind of panic and go, I don't know, or we can talk about all those kind of details that are important and true but not helpful in this moment. Or sometimes we feel like there's this huge burden that we've got to carry the entire thing by ourselves. That's just not how it works. Right? For the very men who walked with Jesus, it took them their entire lives to understand what they had seen. And for all of us in this journey, it takes time. And the idea is we do walk through it together one by one. We come together as a body of Christ to support one another. We connect with our friends, being willing to talk about what's going on in our lives. And when people ask us, we're willing to share. Right? That's the power we receive through Christmas. That's the hope that we have with Christmas. It's a hope that we can carry with us throughout the entire year, and it's a hope that we can embrace so deeply this time of year.